I want to start with a simple sentence that sounds harmless, even noble. We love America. It's on a bumper sticker. It's in campaign ads. Now, it's a declared principle of a major news organization. But here's the problem. Those three words quietly demand something from you. They ask for loyalty before thought, emotion before judgment, and silence when power misbehaves. Because once love is declared unapologetic, criticism starts to look like betrayal. I'm not talking about hating America. I'm talking about something more dangerous, shrinking it. Reducing a country built on liberty, equality, and the rule of law into a slogan that protects the powerful and punishes dissent. You can feel this shift, can't you? In the language, in the tolerance for things that once felt unthinkable. If you care about where this road leads, stay with me. Because before we decide what it means to love a country, we have to ask a harder question. Whose version of America are we being asked to love? And that takes us to the heart of the problem. Let's slow this down and define the real issue. This isn't a fight between people who love America and people who hate it. That framing is lazy, and it's dangerous. The real divide runs somewhere else entirely, between those who see America as a set of ideals and those who see it as a tribe. When a news organization says it unapologetically loves America, it's not just expressing affection. It's drawing a boundary. Inside are the real patriots. Outside are the critics, the skeptics, the uncomfortable voices. But journalism, by definition, is supposed to live in that discomfort. Yes, there is a loud, far-left fringe that treats America as uniquely evil, illegitimate at its core. You don't have to agree with them. I certainly don't. But responding to that excess with blind affirmation creates a new excess one that excuses abuses of power as long as they're wrapped in the flag. That's how standards erode quietly, gradually, under the name of love. To understand how we got here, we need to look backward at the forces that turned backlash into identity and identity into permission. To understand this moment, we have to step back not years, but decades. America has always moved in cycles. Expansion and contraction, reform and backlash, progress followed by panic. Each time the country widens the definition of who belongs, abolishing slavery, expanding civil rights, confronting its own history, there is a counter-movement that feels loss where others see justice. That fear doesn't stay abstract. It looks for language. It looks for leaders. Over time, legitimate critiques of injustice began to blur in the public imagination with something more radical, the claim that America itself is irredeemable. That idea never held real power in government, but it held symbolic power, especially on social media, in activist spaces, in universities, and symbols matter. They became the perfect enemy. Easy to caricature, easy to weaponize. Backlash politics doesn't need accuracy. It needs resentment. So when Donald Trump returned to power in 2024, even after attempting to overturn an election, it wasn't because Americans suddenly embraced authoritarianism. It was because many felt exhausted, pushed into choosing between shame and defiance. But history warns us, when a democracy defines itself by who it opposes rather than what it protects, it begins to lose the very ideals it claims to defend. And that's when the first real rupture appears. The rupture didn't arrive all at once. It arrived disguised as a correction. In 2024, America sent a message. Voters rejected the language of blame America first and returned Donald Trump to office even after an attempted self-coup, even after years of norm-shattering behavior. That wasn't an endorsement of chaos. It was a protest vote against elites, against activists, against a cultural left that many felt spoke about them, not to them. But here's the crisis. The backlash didn't stop where the excesses stopped. Far-left activists had little real power in government or business. Yet they became omnipresent villains in campaign ads, cable segments, and social feeds, exaggerated, distorted, useful. As one progressive comedian admitted, the movement managed to annoy the average American into something darker. Backlash politics feeds on overreach, and then it overreaches itself. What began as resistance to ideological extremism quietly turned into tolerance for something far more dangerous. A leader who treats democratic rules as optional, institutions as enemies, and loyalty as the ultimate virtue. If this sounds familiar, it should. Democracies don't collapse from radical critique alone. They collapse when fear of critique becomes permission for power. If you're still following me, this is where things get uncomfortable, because the real story isn't about slogans, it's about systems. Here's the part most slogans never explain. Democracies don't usually die from coups alone. They erode through incentives. The mechanism is subtle but powerful. When leaders convince their followers that the nation itself is under attack from activists, immigrants, journalists, judges, they shift the moral equation. Actions that would once have been disqualifying become defensible, even admirable. Power stops being constrained by law and starts being justified by loyalty. In that environment, institutions face a choice: resist and be labeled enemies of the people, or comply and survive by bending. Media organizations feel this pressure acutely. Declaring love of country becomes a shield, not against foreign threats, but against domestic suspicion. Skepticism gets reframed as cynicism, accountability as hostility. Meanwhile, the executive branch tests boundaries. Due process becomes inconvenient. Civil liberties become conditional. Foreign policy turns impulsive, driven by dominance rather than rules, even when those rules once made America strong. None of this requires abandoning the Constitution outright. It only requires redefining patriotism as obedience. And once that redefinition sticks, abuses don't look like betrayals anymore. They look like necessities. This is the system at work. And now it produces its second crisis, not theoretical, but painfully real. The second crisis doesn't announce itself with tanks in the streets. It arrives through normalization. Rhetoric once confined to the fringe now circulates at the top. A billionaire amplifies paranoid fantasies about racial survival. Tens of millions see it. A vice president speaks of an entire immigrant community as a problem, language that echoes some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. And suddenly, this isn't shocking anymore. It's debated, rationalized, defended. At the same time, policy follows posture. A government department built for efficiency helps dismantle America's soft power, cutting off aid that once saved lives, stabilized regions, and kept despots from filling vacuums. It costs little. It meant everything. And it's gone. The executive branch stretches itself further, ignoring constitutional limits, acting abroad without accountability, flirting openly with neocolonial ideas, even threatening allies, as if rules were optional when strength feels sufficient. And at home, masked agents detain people without due process, citizens in public, with cheers from those who mistake cruelty for order. This is how decay feels in real time. Not dramatic, just accepted. And the most dangerous part, what this does to ordinary people, to you, without you even realizing it. This is where it stops being abstract and starts touching your life. Because when norms erode, they don't fall on politicians first. They fall on people like you. You feel it when speech becomes risky, not because the law changed, but because the consequences did. When protest starts to look like provocation, when due process sounds like a technicality instead of a right, you notice it when cruelty is reframed as toughness. When empathy is mocked as weakness, when entire groups are spoken about as problems to be managed, not people to be protected, and maybe you tell yourself this won't reach you, that it's aimed at someone else. It always is until it isn't. This is what makes the Love America slogan so hollow. Because loving a country isn't about cheering its power. It's about insisting that power answer to rules, especially when it's inconvenient. If any part of this feels unsettling, that's not a flaw. That's your civic instinct still working. Don't ignore it. Pay attention. And if you think this conversation matters, share it, not to provoke, but to remind others what's at stake. Because what happens next doesn't depend on slogans. It depends on whether people like you stay engaged. What's happening doesn't stop at America's borders. When the United States shifts from rules to raw power, the world notices. Allies recalibrate. Adversaries exploit the vacuum. Soft power, the quiet influence built through aid, alliances, and moral credibility is hard to measure. But once damaged, it's even harder to restore. When America abandons humanitarian leadership, others step in, not with vaccines or food, but with weapons, debt traps, and coercion. Authoritarian governments watch closely. They learn the lesson quickly. If the world's oldest democracy can ignore its own norms, why shouldn't they? Repression gets rebranded as sovereignty. Crackdowns become efficiency. And suddenly, America's lectures about human rights sound hollow even to those who once believed them. This erosion also reshapes global politics. Threatening allies destabilizes alliances that took generations to build. Undermining international law weakens the system that turned post-war America into a superpower without constant war. The tragedy is this: America doesn't lose influence because others hate it. It loses influence because it stops being recognizable. And when that happens, the world doesn't become safer or freer. It becomes more cynical, more fragmented, more dangerous, which brings us to the hardest question of all: what comes next? So where does this road lead? There are three possible futures, not predictions, but paths, and America's already partway down all of them. The first is the optimistic path. Institutions hold, not because leaders suddenly become virtuous, but because courts, civil servants, journalists, and citizens refuse to normalize abuse. Elections remain meaningful, the language cools. Power is restrained unevenly, imperfectly, but enough. America doesn't return to some imagined golden age. It matures. It relearns that patriotism is accountability. The second path is the muddled middle. No full collapse, no renewal either. Norms erode in bursts, then stabilize, then erode again. Each cycle leaves the country slightly weaker, more cynical. People disengage. Politics becomes theater. The Constitution still exists, but more as a reference than a guardrail. And then there's the dark path, the one history keeps warning about, where loyalty replaces law, where elections exist but no longer matter, where violence, once exceptional, becomes policy adjacent, not overnight, gradually, with applause. This isn't tyranny imposed from above. It's consent manufactured from fear. Which future wins depends on a single variable: whether Americans insist that love of country means limits on power, even when it's their side holding it. And that brings us to the final insight. Not about America as a slogan, but America as a responsibility. Here's the truth that slogans can't carry. Loving a country is not a feeling. It's a discipline. It means holding two emotions at once: pride and shame, admiration and alarm, hope and vigilance. The easiest form of patriotism asks nothing of you except applause. The harder kind asks you to stay awake when it would be more comfortable to cheer or to look away. You can love America and still apologize for what it does in your name. You can believe in its ideals and still condemn leaders who betray them. In fact, that's the only way those ideals survive. Because if loving America means excusing the powerful, whitewashing extremism and treating might as morality, then love becomes camouflage, not commitment. The country you inherit tomorrow is shaped by what you tolerate today. So don't settle for bumper sticker patriotism. Demand the harder version, the one that insists on liberty, equality, and the rule of law, even when that insistence is uncomfortable. If this perspective resonated, stay with this conversation. Share it, question it, build on it. Because the America worth loving isn't declared, it's defended. And in the next video, we'll ask the question this one leaves behind. What does real resistance look like in an age of normalized power? That's where the story continues.